You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramas. We're in Washington, D.C.
How's it going, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. We are getting to the end of 2019, heading into 2020. And as we promised our listeners on the last episode, we are going to use this opportunity to reflect on the year gone by as we've done in previous years on the podcast. So 2019 was a pretty significant year in a number of ways. I think we saw a number of flashpoints around the region really go through some interesting developments, from South Asia between India and Pakistan in February, where we had a skirmish, to the crisis with North Korea that now appears to be re-emerging as the year closes out. I think there's a lot to look back on. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover everything in the normal length of an Asia Geopolitics podcast episode, so I do apologize to our listeners if Prashant and I don't discuss what you think was the most interesting issue to come out of 2019 in these regions that we do follow. But the format we decided to actually take for this one was that Prashant and I each, in planning for this podcast, came up with three things that we think we're going to take away from 2019 going forward. And yeah, we're just going to go through and talk through those and, discuss why we feel that those were the top issues that I think we'll really look back on 2019 and see as very significant. Anyways, Prashant, I wanted to pass it over to you to kind of kick us off. Do you want to start us off with the first of your three developments?
Sure. The first one I had was China's 70th anniversary. So the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. China has, a number of these anniversaries. So, virtually every year there's some other anniversary that it's commemorating something. But I think this year was a particular important anniversary for them domestically. I mean, there was a series of parades and commemorations. We even talked about some of the military parades in this episode. And we talked about some of the events that have been occurring in China this year as well, the Hong Kong protests. And so it's been, I would say, the reason why I picked it is that, it's been a big domestic year that the Chinese government, had been forecasting and planning for, but it's been very difficult for them to commemorate it with utter joy, right? I mean, there are a significant number of challenges that China faces at home. There were the Hong Kong protests, the continued focus on the Uyghur situation, U.S.-China trade tensions that have affected the Chinese economy. So it's just, I was in China earlier this year and got to witness some of that. It is important to keep in mind that, even though we see China from this sort of foreign policy lens and international perspective, domestically, China does have its own challenges, and their way they're actually trying to message some of these anniversaries to the population is not really jiving with some of the realities that China is facing. And I think that's one of the issues that we've been seeing this year.
Yeah, and I think the other issue I'd just bring up there is the slowing GDP growth figures in China too. That again, I think adds to this environment of complexity, giving the Chinese leadership I think deep sense of insecurity around many of these issues. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's well played. I mean, the only yeah, I think in thinking about that, I just emphasize. I mean, the Hong Kong protests. I think there's no way that we're not going to look back, regardless of how the protests end. And I know we had a podcast about how they might end before the October 1st anniversary, where we had some pretty gloomy predictions. But we just had the 6-month anniversary, and they're still going strong. But regardless of how things end in Hong Kong, I think there is no doubt that 2019 will be seen as a watershed year for the future of one country, two systems in the Hong Kong context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your first one?
Yeah. So I have a few, but so I was trying to come up with one around South Asia. And it's been a very busy year in South Asia. Of course, in February we had a near descent into full-out war between India and Pakistan. But I didn't go with the Balakot strikes. I did go with, however, the BJP's re-election to power in May 2019 in the general elections, and the very impressive electoral mandate that the party landed with more than 300 seats in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. And qualitatively, listeners might be wondering, well, the BJP has been in power centrally in India since 2014. And yes, that's true. But I think what we're already seeing a little over 6 months into the BJP's second term is a doubling down or tripling down really on the party's nationalist agenda. And, this isn't me being critical. I mean, the party's, if you read the manifesto for 2019's, the BJP manifesto for the 2019 elections, a lot of the things that the party had promised are actually now happening. Not on the economic front, where the Indian economy is seeing, is slowing down quite a bit, and the party doesn't seem to be necessarily willing to stomach some of the bitter medicine of structural reform that international investors and economists have recommended for a long time. But instead, we have things like the changing of Kashmir's status internally, the August 5th decision by India to begin the process of converting the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories, one Jammu and Kashmir and the other Ladakh, primarily done through the abrogation of a constitutional provision, most of a constitutional provision. Article 370 actually hasn't been removed from the Indian Constitution. It's still there, but most of its actual provisions that provided for the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir have been removed. But also this week, as we do this podcast, the Citizenship Amendment Bill just passed the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha in India. That's, again, I think, gotten a lot of scrutiny around the world. So the broader consequences, and the reason I think that we're going to come back to 2019 as sort of a turning point for India, is that I think we're finally sort of seeing what many had feared perhaps in 2014 when Narendra Modi was elected with a powerful mandate. Then now the BJP doesn't, is nationally strong. In 2014 they also had a strong mandate, but now they are less focused on the economic agenda and more focused on the social issues in India. There's also other issues that I didn't mention, including the National Register of Citizens in Assam. We've had a lot of good coverage, actually, at the Diplomat there with reporters based in the region. All of these issues, I think, really portend, I think, a dangerous direction for India. We might find it more common to hear India and Modi specifically discussed in the same breath as other sort of illiberal democratic leaders in the region, including Rodrigo Duterte and potentially European leaders like Orban, Turkey's Erdogan, Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, who's actually going to be India's chief guest at the Republic Day celebrations in January 2020. But for all of those reasons, I do think, I think the Indian election result in 2019, I think, is going to be something that we're going to remember for quite a while coming out of this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that context is really important to keep in mind too, because I think we see this with, not just India, but also other countries that are, active in terms of foreign policy, important countries on the world stage that, if you see this trend where they're behaving very actively on foreign policy, but there are issues domestically with respect to, human rights, pluralism, and so on and so forth, you do have this dynamic that it creates for other countries and external parties, and the United States is no exception to this, that, you may have to contend with a country where you share a lot of convergences abroad, but you may have differences with them in terms of how they govern themselves domestically. And I think, if we see this trend continue to play out, you see this with other countries as well, like Vietnam. It creates an interesting environment. Obviously, India is different because it's traditionally a democracy. But I definitely think, you already are seeing some pockets of the United States in response to measures that we're seeing in India, sort of saying the United States needs to speak out more on these domestic differences, even though India is a big strategic partner of the United States.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of that is happening now in Congress, and there are questions about what happens if, for example, a Democratic administration comes to power. How does the U.S.-India relationship weather that? Because I do think Democrats do care about things like human rights in India and in Kashmir, so that is definitely going to be part of the agenda if that happens.
Absolutely.
So I guess turning it back to you now, what's your second item?
My second item, I was thinking about how best to frame this, but I went with essentially U.S. Asia policy in 2019. We've obviously talked about this, virtually in several episodes in this podcast, but I think, 2019 witnessed, I think, the concretization of a trend where we saw not just concerns across various realms of U.S. Asia policy. We've talked about, virtually all of them: alliances, free trade, democracy, but also the continued disjuncture we've seen in the Trump administration between U.S. policy and some of Trump's rhetoric. We talked about some manifestations of this already. We did an episode, for example, on U.S. engagement in ASEAN, where Trump, again, was not present for multilateral fora, and U.S. representation was so downgraded that several Southeast Asian countries actually expressed significant displeasure at that. But we've also had, any number of concerns on this front. This year, Trump's comments on the Hong Kong protests, where he said, He would stand by the protesters, but he also was, continued to be friends with Xi Jinping, back and forth on a U.S.-China trade deal, negotiations with Japan and South Korea on the terms of burden sharing. And I think it's tough to figure out, one way in which to frame this, but I think there's two takeaways for this for 2019. I think, one is, to what extent is what the Trump administration has done in terms of its contributions to U.S. Asia policy, which is, to my mind at least, a greater focus on competition with China and perhaps some notion of the Indo-Pacific as being an ordering priority for the region. To what extent are those things, which are developments on U.S. Asia policy, actually being overshadowed by some of these uncertainties on alliances, free trade, and democracy, and other fronts that actually have served to undergird U.S. Asia policy for decades? So that's one point. And then the second point is, with the U.S. elections in 2020 that you just referenced earlier, if this is, we're going to see another administration come to office, it's another reset for U.S. Asia policy. So I think there are questions in the region about whether to kind of wait Trump out and see how things play out. But if we see Trump get a second term, then I think that is another interesting scenario, because you do see, with respect to the George W. Bush administration, for example, and other administrations that get a second term, the second term could look very different from the first term. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be better or worse for a second Trump administration. But I think that's the other question, which is that, are we really seeing the height of the Trump administration before another administration takes over, or are we seeing the beginnings of a broader recalibration in U.S. policy that will endure for the next 5 years?
Yeah, no, that's I think a question that a lot of capitals are thinking through. And actually, my next two items are actually somewhat related to U.S. Asia policy. I'm not going to go through both of them now. But I will say that yeah, we are, as of January 2020, we are going to go into potentially the last 12 months of the Trump administration if he's not reelected. And also, as we record this, obviously, impeachment developments in Washington are moving very quickly. And I think that's also being very closely watched. But, if we had to kind of zoom out a bit and look at Asian geopolitics from the perspective of most Asian capitals, I mean, the biggest story really is going to be in many of these places the U.S. election. The biggest story in Asia in 2020 is in many ways going to be playing out in Washington, D.C. in terms of the implications for regional geopolitics, because it is going to matter quite a bit if there is a second Trump term or not, for everything from cost-sharing talks with U.S. allies to also how China is going to think about the trade war and the potential of concluding a phase one deal, which now appears to be set for early 2020. So I think, there's no way that, U.S. Asia policy doesn't merit a place here on our lists.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what was your second one? I guess you had two related ones, but
yeah, I mean, I'll start with the one that's actually less related. I mean, it is related because the two countries involved here are U.S. allies, but it's not related because the United States is sort of a sideline player in the actual mechanisms of the dispute. Now, of course, talking about the rift between Japan and South Korea that has really reached a remarkable breadth this year, right? So a little bit by way of background. So the current tensions really you can really trace them back to the Obama administration and the December 2015 Japan-Korea agreement on the comfort women issue. Korean women that were sexually enslaved by the Imperial Japanese Army. The Korean government had been demanding reparations and an apology from Japan. Under the previous government of President Park Geun-hye, who was eventually impeached, Japan and Korea reached an agreement that was sort of entirely done behind closed doors, without civil society buy-in, and was largely rejected by South Korean civil society. And obviously the issues kind of stewed, and then you had President Moon Jae-in, a progressive, elected in May 2017. And by the end of last year, you were beginning to see the other issues related to history sort of crop up, including a South Korean Supreme Court ruling that Japanese companies had to compensate South Korean workers for forced labor during the Second World War, during Japan's occupation of Korea. And in effect, that ruling sort of blew the lid off the tensions, and Tokyo this summer imposed export controls on South Korea, claiming that materials produced in South Korea had been sent actually to North Korea, where they were being used to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. And there's a lot more complexity to it. We had an incident last December where a South Korean warship locked its fire control radars on a Japanese surveillance aircraft. But broadly speaking, these tensions, I think, are here to stay. At least
Mhm.
during my recent trip to Japan, Japanese officials saw very little room for things to go back to the way they were as long as President Moon Jae-in remains in office. And Moon has still, he just reached the halfway point of his administration, so he has 2.5 years to go in a non-renewable single term. But many of the dynamics and the way that they've played out in South Korea, where you now have a broad, boycott of Japanese materials and really a sort of swelling up of anti-Japanese sentiment on the left and the right, it looks quite uncertain, the trajectory of this relationship. For the South Koreans, what is really at stake now is a fundamental relitigation of the 1965 normalization agreement with Japan. And as far
Mhm.
as Tokyo is concerned, the book is closed on normalization. Normalization cannot be relitigated. So, as far as where the two countries go from here, it's, I think, really going to come down to whether they can find an a face-saving off-ramp here for their respective priorities. There was, of course, the possibility that this dispute was going to cost trilateral cooperation in the region a fair bit, with South Korea announcing in August that it was ready to scrap the 2016 General Security of Military Information Agreement, or GSOMIA, with Japan, which was heavily pushed for by the Obama administration. Of course, they reversed that decision at the last minute on a temporary basis, but if things don't improve next year, we could see this get worse. So I think when we look back, I think and we think about sort of U.S. alliances and trilateralism and regional coordination in Northeast Asia, 2019 is really going to be a year that we talk about for a while. This Japan-South Korea dispute. Um, I think a lot of observers who follow both countries quite closely did not expect for things to really blow up in the way that it did. The
Mhm.
expectation was that you would have the ministries of foreign affairs in both countries sort of handle things behind closed doors as the situations evolved. But this really became a major political dispute. So that, I think, will be something that we'll be talking about for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you alluded to, this is of interest not only to the two countries, but geopolitics more generally, whether you look at it from a U.S. alliance perspective, or you're also seeing and you continue to see the Chinese whenever you see a downturn in the relationship or a mending of ties between the two countries, there'll be outreach to South Korea, outreach to Japan, and it affects broader geopolitical issues like North Korea as well, right? So this is something that's of broader regional interest beyond just these two countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we're on to our final items each. So do you want to start us off with your third and last item?
Sure. So my third one was this notion of an Indo-Pacific concept, and it's something that we've been discussing for a while, including on the podcast. But I think the reason why I had it on the list is because I think 2019 was really the year that we saw the Indo-Pacific, concretize not into just a discussion point among U.S. policymakers or sort of the renaming of a command of some sort, but a possible option for regional order, right? So we saw not only the release of reports from the Department of Defense and the State Department in the US side, but we also saw a mention of the Indo Pacific in other countries that have been talking about the Indo Pacific for a long time: India, Japan, Australia. And I think most notably, we also saw the release of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo Pacific. Which is important, not just because that Southeast Asia is more important than all these other countries. The Southeast Asian countries are much smaller, but because ASEAN tends to be the default option for where regional multilateralism coalesces around. And it kind of helps set the table for whether this Indo Pacific concept is actually going to give us anything in terms of a regional order moving forward, or whether it's a concept that's actually going to sort of ebb as we go into 2020 and beyond. And I think this is something which some people initially had dismissed as being something that's purely a Trump administration issue or a concept. But I really think we kind of have moved beyond that, irrespective of what the United States does under Trump or after Trump. Indonesia is hosting a conference next year on the Indo-Pacific, looking at ideas on regional connectivity, infrastructure. So you really are seeing countries grab onto this, not necessarily as a geopolitical concept designed in terms of great power competition and so on and so forth, but just as a way to think about the region in a more holistic sense beyond the Asia Pacific in and of itself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think next year there's definitely going to be a lot of follow up. So, but again, the question is, does the Indo Pacific or does at least U.S. interest in the Indo Pacific concept outlive the Trump administration potentially in an election
Mhm.
scenario? It's difficult to say. I think there are reasons that a Democratic administration might look to not reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But again, I think it's an open question. So we'll have to see going into next year.
Yeah, and I mean, that point is important to emphasize because I don't know about you, but when I'm out in the region, I think people are very quick to remind people who are based in the US that, I mean, we heard the same thing about the rebalance policy under the Obama administration for such a long time. And then when the Trump administration came into office, the rebalance was declared dead, and now we have a new concept. The TPP was seen as something that was a foregone conclusion, and now the United States is, out of it, at least for now. So I think over the past few years, a lot of incidents and developments have actually reinforced this tendency for regional observers to be very careful and circumspect whenever looking at whether things in U.S. Asia policy are actually going to endure.
Right, right, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And what was your third and final one?
Well, it's going to be pretty unsurprising, I think, to regular listeners of the show, but I have to say the slow collapse of U.S. North Korea talks.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, 2019, I think, we're going to look back. I mean, we're going to look back this whole round of diplomatic engagement with North Korea as really a lost opportunity. I had sort of been arguing for quantitatively and qualitatively capping North Korea's arsenal while we work towards verifiably eliminating it over the long term. The administration did not accept that. The policy was we would only move forward with any kind of arrangement once the North Koreans had agreed to a full roadmap that resulted in their disarmament. And of course, things collapsed in Hanoi with the second U.S. North Korea summit in February. In April, Kim Jong Un announced a end-of-year deadline for the United States, calling on Washington to take a bold decision. In May, North Korea resumed its ballistic missile testing after a pause of more than a year since November 2017. And they've launched 26 missiles this year. It's the busiest missile testing year on record, depending on, the criteria you use to count ballistic missile tests in North Korea. And now, as we sit here in December 2019, it appears that the North Koreans have made a strategic decision to really close the diplomatic door with the United States even before the end of year deadline and move ahead with introducing sort of qualitatively new capabilities like solid propellant, long range missiles that can be more responsive and flexible in a crisis, things that we really shouldn't have allowed the North Koreans to develop. But hey, here we are. There's no deal. There's no more diplomatic negotiation. Trump is, he's calling Kim Jong Un Rocket Man again. The North Koreans are calling Trump a dotard again. So the crisis is back. And, really looking into 2020, we really shouldn't be surprised if things between the United States and North Korea get very heated again in the way that they were in late 2017 and the second half of that year when Trump threatened to totally destroy North Korea. So I'm not going to say a lot more because we just had a podcast episode entirely dedicated to North Korea. But yeah, I think there's no way that we don't think back on what happened in 2019 and not really talk about the total mismanagement of these diplomatic talks with North Korea.
Yeah, and in fact, as we discussed in the last podcast, we might be back with another podcast. Who knows? With this, Kim Jong Un's comments previously about diplomacy, this notion of a Christmas present, and his New Year's Day address as well. So plenty to talk about on North Korea in the weeks to come, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we both talked about our three major issues, but I was wondering. I mean, Asia is a big place. 2019 was a big year, and I know
Mhm.
both of us probably have a lot of honorable mentions. Is there anything you wanted to sort of add as an honorable mention for issues that I think, or at least that you're going to remember from 2019 going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I had, in terms of elections, I think Indonesia's election was quite significant. If you're looking at, India as a major power in Asia and talking about continuity with respect to the Modi administration, I think, Jokowi 2.0 and seeing how Indonesia evolves, that's going to be important, not just for Indonesia's own sake, but because Indonesia does play an outsized role globally, as well as in the region. So I think that would be one which I think I would include. And I think one other thing, I mean, you could make a case, even though this is a geopolitics podcast, that the Hong Kong protests have dominated really the news cycle for so many weeks on end, and in fact several more months than people initially anticipated. That you could make a separate space for Hong Kong as a development on its own terms.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, other sort of notable moments from 2019 that I'd bring up, I'd say the missed opportunity in Afghanistan. Zalmay Khalilzad's deal with the Taliban getting sort of torpedoed by Trump at the last minute. I think that's going to be something that we talk about as a what if for a while. The administration doesn't appear is going to be successful, and it's like its predecessors in withdrawing from Afghanistan, unless something dramatic again happens next year. We haven't really talked about Central Asia, which is something that I know we focus on quite a bit at the Diplomat, but we have obviously continuing a reform in Uzbekistan under Shavkat Mirziyoyev, and Nursultan Nazarbayev formally stepping down as the Kazakh president, giving way to Tokayev as the sort of formal president, but Nazarbayev still continues to really run the show there. Also, just to bring up another issue in terms of China, I will say, I mean, this year really seems like the nature of Chinese authoritarianism has begun to really reverberate in a big way overseas, from the cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor becoming more broadly appreciated in an international context. Obviously, the internationalization of China's network of concentration camps for Uyghurs in Xinjiang, everything from China attempting to censor the NBA. I mean, really, many of these issues have, I think, really changed the nature of the China debate internationally. And, you can look at sort of public opinion polling that really does show that publics in the West have become less sort of amenable to accommodating China and are more sort of aligning with where policy is heading, which is in a more hardline direction. Other issues electorally, maybe, we did just talk about this, but Sri Lanka's election, I think, will be something that we again remember 2019 for as a major turning point. Taiwan's growing international isolation, I think, 2019. I mean, really every year since 2016, there have been other indications, but 2019 was, I think, a particularly big year with the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, all suspending diplomatic ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing. I'm trying to think of any other issues, but those really, I think, jump out to me as major developments this year.
Yeah, I think one other point to note, I mean, when we do these yearly sort of annual takes, sometimes the issues that are more sort of slow burning and that recur, don't really get emphasis, even though there are some notable developments, right? So the issue of climate change, for example, where we see periodic forecasts that are quite dim, including in Southeast Asia, the Mekong in particular, the Mekong River. That's something which, we won't get mentioned in terms of top developments, but I think, warrants attention. Terrorism and the Easter bombings that we saw in Sri Lanka. I mean, that's something that regional governments still are thinking about, even though the focus now is, particularly in Washington, is on great power competition. Still, these non-traditional security threats that are, important to monitor as well moving forward. And then, of course, the South China Sea. Even though I think we can expect that North Korea will continue to dominate the headlines in 2020. The fact that Vietnam is going to be having the chair next year, I think all indications are that if 2019 saw a little bit of a dip in terms of the focus on the South China Sea, we might actually see more of an increased focus on that in 2022.
Right. Well, the one big thing I forgot to mention is the end of the INF treaty in Asia. That's also going to matter quite a bit in 2020. In fact, we're supposed to see, I don't know, I keep hearing that we're going to see an intermediate range ballistic missile test by the United States before the end of the year. And time's running out, so keep an eye out for that. But anyways, Prashant, I know we could do this for several more hours, but thanks a lot for joining me. And this was really fun to kind of reflect on the year that was.
Yeah, it was great.
Great. And for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can do that on Google Play, iTunes, or I guess they're calling it Apple Podcasts now, and Spotify. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. You can do that at any of the places that you subscribe to our podcast. It really does help the show, so we'd really appreciate that. And before we close out, just a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of the Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and Prashant and I will be back soon with more.